Hello, dear friends. Today, the guest of Allat TV is the esteemed Igor Mikhailovich Danilov.
Greetings.
Tatiana.
Greetings. And Jana.
Hello.
Igor Mikhailovich, to be honest, when we were preparing this topic today, and even now, we are not sure whether this program will be released, because the topic that we'd like to touch upon today has never been discussed by you publicly before.
Is it about nuclear physics?
Frankly, I would even say that this topic is much more powerful and is stronger than any nuclear physics in general, because this topic has been worrying people, the minds of people, for a long time. There are a lot of contrived assertions, a lot of misunderstandings about this topic, and naturally, the system fully exploits this. It simply creates fears, various doubts, and confusion in people's minds. But as it is known, knowledge is the only cure for any doubts, for any superstitions. And so today we would very much like to talk with you on the subject of sex and the spiritual path.
Yeah. But this is not a secret. I knew that you were preparing something. But let's agree as follows, all joking aside, that if we touch upon something beyond the limits, I reserve the right to leave something off screen.
Yes, okay.
Because the topic really worries a lot of people. But the topic is not simple. It's both simple and not simple at the same time. Because behind what people are used to calling sex, there are good points, but there are also negative points. And this concerns not only the relationship of men and women or something else, this also concerns things that go far beyond the limits of three-dimensionality.
Igor Mikhailovich.
Knowing your altruism, I understand that you were preparing for this program.
Indeed.
Yes.
But nevertheless...
Therefore, it's better to control the situation.
Igor Mikhailovich, well, probably the first such question is, since we have already voiced the title of the topic, why have you been avoiding public disclosure of this topic for such a long time? And why have you been making this topic such a taboo?
Well, it's because of you, in the first place. I don't mean you specifically, but I mean women in general. Because a lot of mysteries are concealed in a woman, which today's science is far from answering. And as it was said in antiquity, there are keys, not only from heaven in a woman, but also from hell. And this is indeed so. This is a very sensitive topic. So today, as I understand, we will need to elaborate on this topic, but elaborate in such a way that we don't create certain precedents, and to elaborate in such a way that our friends would understand what we want to say, but at the same time, in a way so that we don't lead them to dead ends. First of all, dead ends of consciousness. Why? Because consciousness picks this up and starts using it as a tool, since they said so. And confusion and misunderstanding of some things can lead people into swamps, which they won't get out of. This is also serious.
Igor Mikhailovich, you've said about a woman, about the fact that the keys from heaven and from hell are hidden in her.
And from hell.
And so we were also getting prepared with Jana, and of course we studied the works of sexologists, modern sexologists,
Well done.
what they generally say about a woman. And it is interesting that really all scientists say that women are very mysterious creatures by their nature, starting with the medical and biological features of a woman, and ending with some psycho-emotional factors of perception. But what's interesting is that when describing the nature of female orgasms, female peak states, they say that they are much more diverse, much more individual, much more complex than those of men. And there is no understanding at all in science about how this all happens and what...
And why it has to be so complicated.
And why it has to be so complicated. But you know what is also interesting? The way women describe their peak states. I would like to read this out.
Well, yes. Go ahead.
All of a sudden, I felt very hot. There was a feeling in my head as if everything had moved away into the distance. For a moment, everything became unreal, happy somehow. Intense arousal was accompanied by a complete shutdown of thoughts. an indescribable feeling of freedom and happiness, as if you are being lifted to the top, and then a dizzying descent, a feeling of freedom and flight.
Well, as far as I understand, this is an average description of these peak states by women. But many don't understand what is even behind them, behind these states, and why. It is inherent in them.
Igor Mikhailovich, why is a woman so complex by her nature?
Well, because they are women. After all, a woman is nothing but the source of the power that gives birth to life. And this should be understood. After all, the question is not only, yes, of course, now we have IVF, for example. We can make a human in a test tube. And a person will be complete. If there is a vessel, it will be filled. And there will be a soul, and everything will be there, and the person will grow and live. But anyway, in a woman, there is a moment of impetus of those powers that generate everything. We call them the powers of Allat, just as these powers were called in ancient times. But now people treat them differently, and they are called differently in different countries. But nevertheless, that which is inherent in a woman goes far beyond the limits of trivial three-dimensionality.
Yes, scientists also assert that a woman is more sensitive, that those states that she experiences during an intercourse, yes, with a partner, they most often, to a greater extent, don't depend on the partner's actions. That is, they depend more on psychophysiological and mental states.
This is what they say.
Yes.
No. They depend more on freedom. And there is a question here. Yes, psychology matters. And psyche matters. And hormones matter too. They do. But what is actually inherent in a woman, unlike men, is greater freedom of the personality. These are the original energies, that is, Allat. And this Allat, which prevails in a woman, is 40 times greater than in a man. And one should be aware of this. And a woman, as it was said in ancient times, is actually 40 steps closer to heaven than a man. This has been known from time immemorial.
The strengths of 40 men or of one woman.
Well, what do you think? Here, I'll ask both of you and viewers a simple question. Why is a woman persecuted? She's persecuted in religions, although everywhere it is written, woman, meaning respectfully. It is written. It is interpreted so. But in actual fact, what do we see? Name at least one woman who heads any of the religions nowadays. Religions, well, I'm not even talking about the major ones, at least some others. Name women who really possess certain liberties. I understand that there is democracy in Europe. They are leaders of countries and so on. These are very few, whereas I mean women who would really possess that freedom which men possess. That's the point. And why in many religions, even in religions, while elevating women in writings, they belittle them in reality. After all, a woman, especially in what is related to spiritual aspects, has been persecuted for the last 6,000 years, exactly due to those powers which are in her. And in order to give a little understanding, we won't discuss it in too much detail. These questions are borderline, let's say. So we will say this straight. If a woman headed some religion, that religion would cease to be an organization. It would be, indeed, a spiritual pillar for every believer. And these religions in which women would be leaders, they would lead people along a straight path. But what about organizations? And this is the point. Because an organization must always prevail over the interests of individuals. That is, even despite the fact that it's their participants, their believers. Such is life.
Well, it's just that indeed what you're saying exactly about this borderline of 6,000 years ago.
Well, I'll correct myself a little again. I meant that not just any woman would be a leader, but a spiritually free woman who would be concerned Not about the organization, but about the spiritual component, and she would be free herself. That's when it would be so. Taking into account what we've talked about before, by her nature, a woman is much closer to the spiritual world than a man, and this would naturally have an impact.
Yes, but there is also such a point. You have now clarified that, in fact, the key is not only from heaven, but also
from hell, of course.
from hell. That is, nowadays, a woman in the consumer society also has a bunch of flaws, right? That will provoke.
She has forgotten that she's a woman.
Yes, she has forgotten that she is a woman.
After all, look what is happening. The woman was forced to forget that she's a mother. The woman was forced to forget about her nature. And what has she become?
Yes, it is simply amazing even how the matriarchal society was also described in the past. It was mentioned to what extent a woman was focused on building a single spiritual family, and later on.
Let me digress a bit. Do you know that in fact, equal time has passed? 6,000 years of matriarchy, and it's already been 6,000 years of patriarchy. Such a turning point. I'm just saying.
Yet it is also very obvious, by the way, even from the archaeological excavations, even this very point is clearly observed, how there used to be the cult of a woman, the cult precisely of a mother, the cult of love, and there was a gradual introduction of...
Well, we won't go far. We are in Ukraine, and we are literally a few kilometers away from the so-called Tripilia. And there were ancient settlements there dating back 8,000 years ago and so on, meaning exactly the time when there was and there reigned matriarchy in the world. What do we observe there? Everywhere we see the Allatra signs of spiritual freedom, right? Again, we see those very women, those very images and everything else, where there was actually extolled. Well, it wasn't just in Tripilia, there were such settlements all over the world. And of course they existed after, let's say, the 6th millennium, in the 4th millennium BC as well, closer to us in the 3rd millennium. But fewer, fewer, and fewer. And the closer to us, the fewer and fewer. And what do we see lately? How quite artificially the Allatra sign is being removed from various religions, including Islam. After all, it prevailed until recently, and what do we see now?
It is interesting that even in science there is information about the last 6,000 years, whereas if we already take information about that period which you are talking about, the first 6,000 years before this very turning point, science seems to be in no rush to study it.
Well, we are talking to grown-up people, and if we've decided to talk about sex, then we can also talk about this. We hope that grown-up people are watching us, who perfectly understand that history is being written by people, and it's being written to please those who pay for it. Therefore, naturally, we have everything distorted. If to this day we can enter any school in any country and they will tell us that literally recently there were Neanderthals. Well, and later on, until, well, generally speaking, Darwin's theory, so as not to delve deeper, that people originate from monkeys, and that we are gradually evolving, and this is, pardon me, the first civilization which is developing. But there were a lot of these civilizations, in fact. We might digress from the topic which you've voiced, because too much proof has been preserved of the fact that indeed there were civilizations which greatly surpassed the current civilization. There were similar civilizations and more than once.
Igor Mikhailovich would like to proceed to the subject of people's questions, to what concerns them the most regarding this topic.
Well, here's the first question. Is it good or bad to have sex?
Such a simple question that we've encountered.
Well, I'll respond like this. If we remove all pros and cons, because many questions arise here, is it good or bad to do physical activity? A simple question. Sex is just like everything dual in this world. And it may be discussed as a dual structure as well. On the one hand, it's commonplace physical activity, sort of people's natural need. Well, if it didn't exist, then at least we wouldn't be sitting here, right? And no one would see us. Because it's a process of life conception, first and foremost. Whereas, is it good or bad? I'll put it this way, if rules of hygiene are observed, and there is no violence, and there's mutual consent and desire, then what is bad here?
You mean psychological violence or some...
Both psychological and physical and the like. After all, this is also often used.
Issues of domination, right? So...
Surely. Why? Because it stimulates the animal essence in people. And basically, most people today are practically no different from animals in the matters of sex. Meaning, they are driven by those very instincts. Well, this is what we are being told, at least from the perspective of science. Well, it is not so. People are far from being animals. Of course, there's an animal part, and consciousness dictates something of its own and tries to place people within certain boundaries and lump them with animals, so to say. But people are not animals. There's a certain part, even when people behave like those very animals, I mean men. It's rare for women, it mostly happens with men. But what dictates this in them? Dominance, possession, right? Because another synonym of sex is possession of each other, if we may say so, right? And what does it mean to possess anyone? It means to have power over them. So the desire and aspiration to prove something or to gain some kind of power also pushes towards these moments. Well, I mean, to intimate ones. Whereas if sex is consensual, in love, in friendship, and moreover, if people are married, then for heaven's sake, no problem at all.
Igor Mikhailovich, it seems that from some medical...
And you've just touched upon medicine, precisely a matter of hygiene. This is extremely important. And as a person who deals with medicine, so to say, the processes of exchange of liquids mean the exchange of microorganisms as well. That's why don't forget about this too. But spiritual hygiene is much more important. This is extremely important because people often confuse this and don't understand what it is. While consciousness often pushes because when a woman, as you say, reaches the highest states, she practically breaks away from her body. And in this particular moment, she kind of radiates those powers which are being generated in her. And these powers are extremely sweet for a man, even if he doesn't know that they exist in nature. So let's try. Let's consider such an aspect. And many viewers will recall and hear. And many already know these moments. What is a man striving for, even if he dominates, even if he is selfish and doesn't care, as they say, about women's satisfaction? But on the other hand, those who are completely selfish have an animal instinct. Well, they are gratified by power. Power over whom? Power over a woman. This is also not a simple aspect. And here too, it is worth thinking about. This is power over that divine which is concealed in her. Who implants such aspirations and desires into his head? It's also worth thinking about. Whereas the majority of men, when trying to satisfy themselves, are actually striving for what? For satisfaction of a woman. Why do men build giant corporations? Well, we refer to successful men who never have enough of anything. For money? For power? Many will say, of course, yet what do they need power for? For controlling women. Why do they need control over women? In order to receive that invisible, which, let's say, they get from women, to receive it in a greater measure and more often.
Do they have it themselves?
Their attention, the attention of women themselves. There is such a point.
Why don't men generate it themselves, according to the male nature?
A man by nature cannot generate the powers of Allat. He has, well, in the East, it is called prana, energy of life, and so on. Yes, it's embedded since birth. Well, anti-Allat can be generated by mostly in sodomy. especially if there's a group. Well, these are already sort of magic things. But a lot for a man? No. A man consumes.
That is, the source of Allat in this world is solely
A woman.
a woman.
And there is also such a
And she's also the conductor of these powers.
point that it's clear what benefit a man has from sex, yet what makes sex interesting for a woman? From the perspective
For a woman, sex is interesting exactly because of these states. Well, there's plenty in sex to interest modern women. It's prosperity, it's protection, and it is, well, a source of income and comfort, so to say.
And what about the invisible side?
Exactly these states, when they break away from their body, they feel themselves as personality. That's when, like Tatiana has read one woman's example for us. And at that very time, they gain true freedom, even if a woman knows nothing about the spiritual and has never worked on herself. But she's capable of generating these states, so to say. She feels what she doesn't feel in her everyday life. And this is very appealing. And here neither man nor anyone else plays any role. Here precisely these states predominate.
But this is if
But they are appealing also to her consciousness. After all, she gets devoured immediately. And note how an emotion, a desire, arises in people. Well, how to put it more carefully? Well, generally speaking, a desire of sex. What gets activated after it?
The
Consciousness.
system.
Material desires arise, something else, someone wants to eat, meaning the mechanism of the animal nature switches on in a person with an active consciousness, because thoughts, as a rule, always digress to the material side. Why? A simple question. This is also a significant factor.
Igor Mikhailovich, and could you please tell us in more detail about what sexual energy is? May we expand on this topic?
Well, sexual energy is a forerunner of the Allat powers. The system itself stimulates. Well, this also affects hormones. That is, we already observe hormonal changes, surges of hormones, when this awakening takes place. In the beginning, there's a surge of sexual desire, and then the body starts producing these hormones. Naturally, a physiological desire for that very sex already arises too. But who's behind this? Behind that very sexual energy? As a rule, consciousness is behind this. Meaning, it is its tool of replenishment of its reserves, so to say.
And what about flirting? After all, it's not leading to sex, but it is images in one's head.
There's no difference. For understanding, I'll just explain that there's no difference at all. Whether there are actions in reality or there are actions in one's head. Flirting is precisely stimulation of that very sexual energy, which is aimed at what? At subsequent generation of the Allat powers. What for? A simple question.
So, if a person is on a spiritual wave, then it's basically
Well, here also, let's say a person who engages in the spiritual, who's on the spiritual path, hence he has no sex. No, this is wrong. There's nothing sinful or immoral here. If again, hygiene is maintained, and everything, so to say, is appropriate within the cultural norms, well, within cultural and moral, and people's customs which exist in one or another community, and their religions, and all the rest, then there is nothing bad or shameful here.
right. Often this particular question is heard: is sex a hindrance on the spiritual path?
Nothing is a hindrance except the system. Sex cannot be a hindrance on the spiritual path. Another thing is that there are practices, well, the so-called celibacy practices, right? Why? Because after the fear of death, sex is actually the second most significant tool of the system itself, by which it enslaves a person, by which it disarms and leads him astray from the spiritual path. This is true.
Igor Mikhailovich, and could you expand more on celibacy? Because a lot of people believe that this is exactly what brings one closer to God, that it is what helps to accumulate or to preserve some energies in the body, which will help to achieve
What energies? A good question.
the state of enlightenment.
If a human were a battery, he could do this, right? He could accumulate some energy and then use it on something. As a rule, those very sexual energies which a human generates, well, a woman in particular. By the way, a man also consumes, he feels them. And he feels them very strongly. Well, this is a separate topic. What is celibacy? Celibacy means exactly getting rid of Satan's power in oneself, of one of his tools. This is needed by those who are really on the spiritual path and who cannot cope with thoughts and desires imposed on them specifically when it comes to sex. Not because sex is bad or something is wrong with it, no. Just because this prevails in him and limits his capabilities. That's why a person adopts celibacy. However, celibacy doesn't mean that he doesn't have intimate relations. It goes without saying he doesn't have intimate relations, but he doesn't think of those either. And he doesn't support a single thought in his head about it. That's when it's celibacy. Whereas if a person, pardon me, thinks about it and thinks about not thinking about it and so on, and this goes on all day long, what kind of celibacy is this, guys? These are games, again, the games of consciousness.
Many people also write that, well, sex is love, and love leads to God. Is this so, in actual fact?
Sex isn't love. Is physical activity love? A simple question. Well, people play tennis. Is this love? This is, pardon me, sports. These are certain physical exercises, which, yes, are based on the game of several partners, often of the same gender at that. In the modern world, this is actually, well, what does love have to do with this? And if sex is removed, has love disappeared? Then what is it? Love or sex? Love leads to God. Will a person actually get anywhere because he, pardon me, has sex with someone? If they don't maintain hygiene, they will end up visiting my colleagues, but nothing more.
Also, Igor Mikhailovich, you've touched on the topic of sex and the fear of death, that you've said that the system uses these points.
Of course.
It's just that we can indeed observe how in the modern consumer society, exactly through mass media, through the surrounding space, this very topic of sexual images is precisely being stimulated. Because basically, well, I know specifically from the advertising market that such topics as imposition of sexual images are being used and used very actively. Because when it comes to the violence and fear, at least there are some legislative regulations. But precisely in sex matters, the system is sort of active and actively promotes these images. And on the one hand, it turns out that imagination is kind of actively working. The subject is being actively stimulated inside a person, while on the other hand, certain restrictions are imposed by society. That is, this is such a thing tearing a person apart inside.
Norms of morality.
Norms of morality, right, meaning it's tearing one apart inside.
Well, this is natural. Let's take a look. There exists, let's say, a generally accepted sort of fashion, for example, for hair color or something else. Well, and here certain people make themselves prominent. No matter what they call themselves, they stand out sharply. What for? What is actually behind this?
Desire, alpha maleness, yes, alpha males.
Alpha females, alpha males, meaning to stand out in a crowd so as to be more conspicuous for others. What's behind this? Desire of sex. But does this desire of sex come from the person himself, or is it being imposed on him? And here a question arises, yes, why do animals have sex? Well, for propagation of the species, let's say so. Although, yes, there are some animals that are like humans. For them, it's attractive.
Meaning these basic mindsets, right? Sex and the fear of death are those things which the system...
Through which the system manipulates a person. And these are those guards, let's say, on his spiritual path, which he must step over. If a person gets rid of dependency, not of sex, but of dictatorship, when he starts realizing that it's just a tool which can be used, well, let's say, for one's benefit, but which can also inflict harm, and the person uses it carefully, or doesn't use it at all, it's his choice, his business. But he gets rid of the dependency which the system imposes on him, not of his striving for sex or a desire of sex, but of the manipulation around this topic first and foremost. Well, here's a simple example. If a person is not going to have it today or tomorrow, well, that's life. Why think about it? After all, there's nothing more valuable than attention and time. When a person pays attention, just like Jana said, to images, and after all, the system eats absolutely the same way, both in images and in reality during this process. Does a person lose anything? He does, and he loses a lot. He loses those powers and that time which he could have spent on spiritual development. He loses contact with the spiritual world. What's the point if, at this time, he is nothing but a dead creature? Well, isn't it so? And the topic of sex consumes and drowns out the person's spiritual aspiration entirely. And those lies and deception which the system creates, imposing, when I'm with this person, having sex with him, or having sex with her, we feel each other. We feel good after it. Well, excuse me, these are hormonal surges. And the system again supports this illusion. It's good, yes, when both of them spend these powers on feeding the system. So what's good about this? It's good when these powers are spent, for example, on propagation of the species or something else, or just on satisfying each other. But when any spiritual aspects get involved here too, well, that's a total delusion.
And here's a very frequent topic, the point that we follow the spiritual path together and practice lotus during sex.
What is lotus? Lotus is a spiritual practice. At that, it's a very profound spiritual practice, to which a person should devote himself entirely, not through consciousness, but through personality. It's a contact with the spiritual world. If we look at it from a standpoint of religion, for example, Christianity, it's the same as if you were standing at the altar in front of God's face, and what are you doing at this time? You and your partner are going to God while doing lotus and having sex, right? Is this what one does at the altar? A simple question. No one would ever think of this. Whereas here you can do it. God doesn't see, right? It's a simple question. However, people not just perform this ancient meditative, as you say, or rather spiritual practice,
Recite prayers and mantras, yes.
but often they also use various magic techniques, prayers, mantras, and many other things during sex. It's beyond understanding, to be honest. Another thing is, if immediately after, especially for women, well, it won't hurt men either. After peak states, when she has flown up and then landed back, here, she should stop thoughts about the earthly, the mundane, and the dead. She should forget about unwashed dishes or something else, or that she has to run somewhere. At this point, yes, a prayer or a meditative practice can be done, depending on your religious beliefs. That's when it will be beneficial. Why? Because there's an inner power which is redirected to the spiritual. Then it is beneficial. But this doesn't mean that you should have sex in order for a prayer to be more successful, so that for God to hear you. No. Don't confuse the system's desire to eat with your spiritual aspirations. And most importantly, you shouldn't tell anyone about it, how you use it, and what results you've achieved. After all, people often talk about this as well. We did this or that during sex, and we really felt. The system will throw it in. It will create an illusion for you, with nice pictures in your head, but your pictures will be three-dimensional, while the spiritual world is not three-dimensionality.
That's why this is dangerous.
And everyone who tells about it, they tell about physiological sensations that take place, right? Meaning in the physical body. Again, about three-dimensional pictures, what visions it throws into them. Who throws them in? Consciousness. And who tells one about it? People who are far from the truth. Those who don't understand what a human being actually is, who he is as personality. He cannot even separate or identify himself, whether he is consciousness or personality, where he is and who he is. And in this case, of course, the system manipulates him like a blind kitten and imposes its desires, which the person perceives as his own desires.
Can we say that the system imposes false feelings on a person?
This happens all the time. It's always like that.
Igor Mikhailovich, but how to, well, now a question arises among people. How to, let's say, have sex so that it would be beneficial in spiritual terms, so as not to do harm spiritually?
I've just told that. In order not to do harm in spiritual terms, the following rule must be observed: matters of hygiene. Because when your body is sick, it will distract you. As well as spiritual hygiene, meaning, well, don't mix and don't waste.
There is another question about celibacy, meaning about accumulation of powers. There is an opinion that men are unable to abstain for a long time, while women are able to abstain for years.
I'll put it simply. 8,000 years ago, yet a human being absolutely hasn't changed. People had sex in order to propagate. Whereas 6,000 years ago, there exactly began the cult of sex, which started to be actively imposed on people's consciousness. Why? Well, a governmental setup appeared, and civilization began to develop. What started developing immediately? Fear of death and the cult of sex. Well, isn't it so?
A powerful lever of control.
Of course. And afterwards, such mindsets began to appear, that celibacy is harmful for the body, and so on. Well, what's harmful about it? A simple question. What harm will occur? After all, a body discharges what is excessive and recycles what it needs to recycle. How else can this be harmful? From the psychological perspective, but excuse me, what is the psychological perspective? It's the devil's dictatorship in your head that makes you do something. Well, the spiritual path is intended precisely for that, to defeat him in yourself, to step over him and move on. Isn't that so? Well, I see no harm here either for men or for women.
It's just that often...
It's everyone's personal business. Someone does physical exercises in the morning, someone doesn't. There are people who don't brush their teeth, and there are people who simply have nothing to brush. And what's wrong with that? It's funny, but...
Yes, it's just that it often depends on the opinion of people around, meaning it...
Absolutely, and here you are right. After all, a certain halo is being created simply by people's talks around that very sex. And who are people? They are... Well, I'm sorry, friends, but we often act like monkeys, copying each other and repeating something after someone foolishly. And very often, incorrectly. And I'll give you a simple example about children. Many who have dealt with children, or who have them, they know this themselves and they can confirm. It's a problem to ask a child to learn a nice, short poem by heart. But once a child hears an obscene song, he memorizes it word for word, while he doesn't remember a good one. Why? And why is a person attracted precisely to the information which isn't really useful? And why does it get recorded in his consciousness?
Very quickly.
And why does a person strive to imitate someone who, let's say, isn't very useful for society? Or thoughts that are not quite nice are remembered for a long time. A simple example. A man went to a store, to a bank, doesn't matter where, and he saw or heard a scene. Everything was good. He talked with one person and then with another one, but then someone quarreled with someone and talked about something emotionally. What happens? He gets infected emotionally, and this person returns home or to work, doesn't matter where, and begins to retell with the same intonations in the same manner. Why? A simple question. Haven't any of you asked yourself, let's put it so, why are you doing this? Why are you multiplying evil? After all, this is not what is good. We have the same situation on television. What do they show us, and what do they get us used to? To anything good? No, and thus, evil exists as long as we allow it to be. It's in our heads, first of all. If we remove it from our heads along with stupidity, what's pure and good will remain. Isn't that so? Including that which has to do with sex.
Yes, there is also the following question from the youth. A young man writes that he has thoughts and perhaps it's better to be chaste like an angel, while if I do a foolish thing and have sex, then it will probably be my complete spiritual downfall.
I'll put it in a little joke here in order to diffuse this nonsense. Why don't angels have sex?
They are incorporeal beings.
They have nothing to do with
They have nothing to do with it, right? Here's the whole answer. If they had a body, they would do physical activity. If they had genitals, they would have sex. Well, I'm just giving an example, sort of. As for this person, he says chaste. What does the word chastity, Russian celamudriya, mean? I understand how this is exploited
Nowadays,
in literature. And what do you understand by this word?
purity,
Purity of what?
inner purity.
After all, the word speaks for itself. It means complete wisdom. That is, a person who possesses knowledge, the true, simple, and pure one, as you say. And to be chaste doesn't mean not to have sex. It means to possess knowledge, and not just to possess it, but to be a person of knowledge, hence to use this knowledge in relation to oneself first and foremost. If he, this person, becomes chaste, he won't have such ridiculous questions. And he doesn't need to accumulate any energy, for he's not a battery. I'm not saying that sex isn't a source of energy. It is. Even from the perspective of physics, ordinary aspects of friction cause free electrons, don't they? The question is different. Sex contributes to manifestation, and as a tool, it's been used from time immemorial for an increased, so to say, energy surge. What do people do with this surge and with this energy? When they are simply controlled by consciousness, like this young man.
Igor Mikhailovich, you've just mentioned those surges that they have always existed, have always been generated. And I'd like to talk about the fact that cases are known in history when there were groups of chaste people, specifically chaste young women. And it's very interesting what you've just said, that chastity means possession of knowledge. And there are mentions of precisely such groups during the pre-Sumerian period. It is specifically described that the Sumerians had sisters of God.
Well, I just wanted to say that these groups were there. They existed even in Sumerian times. They existed, let's say, later on too. This is normal. This is natural.
So what is the sacred role of a woman for existence of the entire civilization, for society? May we expand on the subject?
Of a woman or of female groups?
Of female groups.
That's a huge difference. Since a woman herself as an individual is capable of giving life, and without a doubt, but a group, especially if it's an open group, it works for everyone. It's capable of giving life to the entire human community, meaning to all people. And the difference here is huge. But what, as you say, is the point of these groups? The point is life. True life. That is attained even during this lifetime, in which life has no final end. That's what the point of these groups is.
Igor Mikhailovich, we have now come to the topic, in my opinion, an important topic for the spiritual development of society. It's the topic of female groups. Because it's interesting that it is mentioned in the history that at all times, on different continents, in different religions, even let's say before the establishment of religions, there were female groups. And we would really like to read aloud. Well, let's say we cannot read aloud everything, but we can read aloud some examples that are more illustrative, because we would really like you to comment on them for a better understanding of why these groups existed and what they were created for. Maybe?
Go ahead.
Could you?
Let's try.
Right. Well, would like to begin with the fact that in the sacred text of Hinduism, the Agni Purana, 8 mothers and 64 yoginis are mentioned, who were the aspects of divine femininity. And their ability to create and destroy worlds is mentioned. Moreover, in India, there were Devadasis, translated as Deva, god, Dasi, female slave. The girls who served a deity in India were called so. And as a result of training, the bodies of Devadasis became sacred vessels. through which pure power and energy of goddess Lakshmi was flowing.
I'll insert a comment. This is a modern interpretation, God's female slaves. They were never called so during their lifetime.
They served indeed.
To serve and to be a slave is a great difference. Only Satan has slaves. God has no slaves.
Right. Besides, they were sensitive to the slightest nuances of subtle vibrations. They could skillfully perceive mighty energies of invisible planes and influence them. It was also believed that the energy of devadeses ensured the flow of blessings to the whole kingdom and the entire world, to everything living.
There are also the following examples. This relates to women who lived in the lands of Canaan, it's the present-day Israel, Syria, and Jordan. The temple servants of the goddess of love, fertility, and sexual ecstasy, Kadesh, were called Kadeshas, and this word always meant to be holy. However, when authority of the church came, it certainly made its adjustments and distorted everything, and in particular, it distorted all these sacred mysteries and the ancient knowledge of previous centuries, and since that time, these women were already called loose women and traitresses of God Yahweh, and precisely...
Let me put in a little correction. After all, for instance, for many centuries, Mary Magdalene had been called a loose woman, while later on they apologized for that. And why?
However, in consciousness, it became fixed as...
And they were called exactly the same. After all, that was merely a fight for the interests of the organization, and not for spiritual salvation of people. However, all these groups which you've now mentioned, it is clear that there were a lot of them, but they are, let's say, echoes of the first group which existed at the beginning of our contemporary civilization. It was formed 12,000 years ago. And just think, for 6,000 years, this group was keeping the devil on a leash. And throughout 6,000 years, there were no wars. He just didn't have power here. I'm now talking about the Allat sisters. In speaking of the Allat sisters, or as they were also called, the heavenly birds. Why? Because they resided between the worlds, and they didn't leave for that world, but they couldn't be called earthly inhabitants either. Yes, they did have bodies, yes, they exploited their bodies, but they exploited them for what? So that, like a springboard at these very moments of breaking away, just like at the beginning of our conversation, you've read, when a woman gets a surge. And by pushing off from it, they went even further and plunged even deeper, flying up to the heights. And it's from there that they were bringing that which gave peace and which gave life to everyone. Who felt them? Who understood them? I would compare them, well, to something ordinary and earthly for people to understand. In Japan, there were women, well, there still are, ama. These are pearl divers. They dove very deeply, deeper than men were able to. They spent much more time underwater, and naturally, they procured the biggest and the most valuable pearls, and their community lived thanks to their ability. Because pearls were expensive, and this made it possible for them to exist. And so here, this is not quite a correct parallel, but it gives at least some understanding of what the purpose of these women is. By using also sexual practices, well, again, it's stupid to treat this as sex, which we are used to in this world. Well, although from an outsider's viewpoint, if someone looks, well, what will he see? Women who are having sex with each other, for they didn't have men among them. Generally speaking, in such groups, a man could only be there at the beginning of the group formation, and his function was exactly to be exploited by women. They used him as a detonator for an explosion. Well, excuse me for such a parallel. It's just that it cannot be called otherwise. While later on, when the group was formed, male individuals couldn't even be around because male energy, which is the energy of consumption, was unnecessary there. By uniting in purity, they were flying up to heaven as a single whole and bringing that which, well, it's impossible to describe this in words. What kind of pearls or what kind of diamonds or anything can we talk about compared to that source of power, to that life which they are bringing? But again, yes, they possessed enormous power, and in one of the programs we talked with you about the fact that the Allat sisters could turn plains into mountains, and mountains into plains, and this is really so, but it's not their main task. To influence climate, to stop, it's not their main task. Their main task is to keep the devil on a leash and to give life to those who aspire. And there's a little nuance here. What does it mean? Who's with them? Who felt and who perceived? Whom to give and how to give? Well, I'll digress to our earthly again so that people understand. Because we are now talking about something that we know. Well, for people who are far from this, it's not quite clear. Just imagine, dear friends. Say, you are listening to a certain melody in headphones, rhythmical, nice music. Naturally, you involuntarily begin to move to the rhythm, just like the girls are doing right now. You are on the same wavelength. You are in a certain resonance with this music, even though it's coming through the headphones. It creates a certain rhythm. Naturally, identical feelings and sensations appear, right? And there approaches a person who doesn't hear this music. He's not in resonance with you. But he's listening to different music. Let's say you are listening to melodious, nice and rhythmical music, while he's listening to some violent and harsh one. Will he resonate with you? No, he'll be in discord with you. This is a huge difference. And now, I'll give one more example. For understanding of this example, let's take radio. For instance, I've switched it on a certain wave. You've switched it on the same wave. Well, and you, our friends, have switched it on this wave too. And we are now listening to the same wave. What do we also get into? Into a certain resonance. We are united by a shared information field at this moment. Thoughts of a certain kind arise in us. Yes, from the system, stereotypically. Stereotypically, it puts them in everyone's head, almost in the same way. If we invest our attention in some topic, and here comes a person who's listening to an entirely different wave, will he understand us?
He won't.
He won't. In this case, it's the same. In order to understand how it was happening, this is when people actually lived by the spiritual. They were attuned to the wave of the spiritual world, to love, to true love, and not the one that we discussed in the beginning, like love for physical activity, so to say. They truly strived for God. And these gifts, these heavenly pearls which the Allat sisters procured, like the Amma divers, it was so invaluable. This is such a great power that shortened the path multifold for people who followed it. And their every practice which gave these impulses to people was felt by this community. Well, naturally, people grew stronger, while the system was simply powerless. And there's one more nuance here. The system is extremely powerful. In this understanding, by the system, I mean, if in religious terms, Satan, the devil, or Iblis, no matter how we call it, this is the system. But it has power over individuals, over groups of people. However, if all humanity is united by one spiritual goal, the system becomes powerless. especially when there are such helpers as the heavenly birds. This is really wonderful. Well, on the other hand, they managed to preserve it for 6,000 years, but in the end, it fell to decay too. And here, I'd also like to mention a little bit, after the Allat sisters left, their assistants stayed. Now, a few words about the structure. There were 12 Allat sisters, to make it clear. Each of them had assistants. And these 5 assistants who were there also formed a united group with the Allat sisters. But those whom we call the Allat sisters were truly like birds. They spent most of their time between the worlds, while their assistants just helped them to subsist in this world. Well, here's a simple example. I hope our friends have understood how important and how valuable this is. Those very pearls which they procured were priceless. And imagine, instead of diving for these pearls, they had to prepare food for themselves, to wash their clothes, well, banally, like in the modern world, to make the bed. Sort of natural human needs. How much time does that take during the day? A lot of time. While their time is extremely valuable for humanity. And when they didn't supply humanity with the pearls, humanity simply became poorer. Well, I'm just speaking in human terms. Therefore, it's natural that they had assistants who did this work for them. They didn't possess that power, but they were getting prepared to replace those who didn't return. After all, that happened too. Those who simply didn't fly back. Then one of the attendants, the worthiest one, would take the vacant place. That's how the structure of these heavenly birds was formed. There's no other way to call them. However, after they left, when the devil was actually defeated, there remained Allat, those assistants whom I've told you about. And basically, they kept the fire burning. Well, fire not in the meaning of fire in a stove, or as they say, woman is the keeper of hearth, right? This originated precisely from there. It was said about the inner flame, and not just, as our respected historians explain to us nowadays, that women kept the fire. The home hearth, somewhere in a cave, the fire was valuable, so that it wouldn't die out. This is ridiculous, believe me. It was said precisely about the inner flame and the priceless gift. And going back to Allat, this was exactly the function they took on. Well, centuries went by, millennia went by. And it happened so that one of the leaders, the senior Allat, who was often in the world with her, sisters among people, to see the way people lived and so on. Allat had such a practice. For the Allat sisters, it was unacceptable. While for Allat over time, they got accustomed to the world, to people. And naturally what happened did happen. She paid much attention to mundane things. Well, let's say, to beautiful clothes or something else. She invested her attention into trite earthly things. The system reacted to this very quickly. It made her fall in love with a man. Since she fell in love with earthly things, that means she got an earthly interest. Naturally, the system seduced her, having offered her a man, and she gave birth to a boy. And since she was already controlled, for her the whole world came down to her child, to her boy, and she endowed him with power. That was the moment when matriarchy ended. And literally, several centuries after this, I emphasize centuries, for understanding how strong was the inertia set by the Allat sisters. Several centuries later, one of the first states emerged, where El's followers started ruling, meaning those very servants or slaves of the devil. That's how the world became civilized. It's a sad story. Well, and now, note, I mean the Allat sisters, they worked for the whole society, while these groups that you are reading about worked for the state, let's say, for some communities, for a limited number of people. There were those who worked for closed orders, literally worked. When the Allat sisters were there, they bestowed this power on everyone. While here it turns out it was limited. And this is important because there were a limited number of those who could come into resonance with them. Yes, they gained certain powers, benefited from that. And thank God there were such groups that could give this power to at least a small number of people. Well, unfortunately, not to the whole world. And when a certain group is closed, it is finite. That's why they ended.
Igor Mikhailovich, once, a few years ago, you told us about Sophia's group. And at that time, of course, we recorded what you said in our diaries.
Yes, this happened.
And now, if you let us, may we read aloud what you said, this information valuable for all people.
Give it a try. Well, anyway, I have reserved the right to edit this program.
After the group of people under the leadership of the so-called white monk in 1114 discovered an artifact under the former Church of Virgin Mary on Mount Moriah, which gave them an indescribable spiritual surge in pure knowledge, they organized the so-called Order of Knights Templar. The main goal of these knights was to serve the spiritual world and people. When the order began to grow, in the inner circle, they created the so-called First or Sophia's group, which was also called Maria's group in honor of Mary Magdalene. It consisted of 12 women and was a secret source of spiritual power of the knights who were initiated into this sacrament and were in constant connection with this group at the spiritual level and at the level of feelings. Of course, this gave them a huge advantage over their enemies and made this order so powerful. But their problem was that they were focused on themselves, meaning the order was a closed organization and therefore it was finite. The knights perfectly understood this, but because of fear of losing power, they didn't hurry to reveal themselves to all people. That's why they postponed this, so to speak, until the last moment. Well, and when this last moment began to approach, before revealing the order, they decided to bring Maria's group, their most secret part that was giving them strength, into accordance with the ancient group of the Allat sisters, from 12 heavenly birds to 72. Of course, it was the right decision, but a far too belated one. After all, the devil doesn't sleep, whereas creation of such a group requires a lot of time. Despite the fact that under the auspices of the knights there were also women's monasteries and that there were no problem with those who wanted to enter this group, it would take years even for those who have potential to be educated and taught to fly while diving. And one shouldn't forget about God-fighters, and that meant a waste of time. There were those who couldn't reach heaven, and they also left the group. Although some returned after individual work on themselves, but definitely not all of them, whereas God-fighters are a waste of time in general. Because when a woman entered the group, first of all, she had to defeat the dictatorship of demons in her head, to overcome her own egoism and pridefulness, to feel the group and to come into resonance with it. But when a candidate had earthly attachments, something in this world that was much dearer to her than the spiritual world, or irresistible egoism which evoked envy towards others instead of love, such individuals began to be dissonant with the group, and demons in their heads intensified doubts in what they were doing there. And in actual fact, what can a person see with earthly eyes? a group of women who only have sex with one another and perform spiritual practices. After all, the spiritual eyes of God fighters are covered by demons, and they couldn't see how in the invisible world these women hovered outside their bodies like heavenly birds. Thus, the visible earthly is what gave rise to doubts in their thoughts. And, as it is known, one of the guards on the spiritual path is doubts. If a person couldn't overcome it by practical training and studying how the system controls him through thoughts, how it implants thoughts and makes him take them as his own, then the heavenly gate is closed before such a person controlled by the devil. Naturally, such people become God fighters because they are devil's puppets, and he is precisely the chief God fighter. And having returned to the monastery, they begin to sow doubts in the heads of other women. And as everyone knows, God fighters are lazy in serving God, but they are active in serving Satan. Just like serial maniacs, they experience internal unease which they are unable to cope with until they knock someone off the spiritual path or sow doubts, similarly to a deadly virus. But besides serving the devil, what they also have in common is fear, the fear of emptiness, as if there is a black abyss before them. They can be joyful and active, but only when among people. But when they are left alone, they lose inner peace. Coldness and emptiness are their eternal companions. But due to their efforts and stupidity, spreading among female communities, the number of candidates was decreasing, and the Templars succeeded in recruiting only 33 true servants instead of 72 before the system reacted in full force, having destroyed the order completely. All 33 heavenly birds flew up and didn't return to Earth again. Thereafter, their followers started carrying 33 pearls strung on a thread. Each of these pearls had a name corresponding to the names of the departed heavenly birds. And while touching every pearl, they commemorated the name of each of the heavenly birds, asking to take them along. Certainly, if the knights had had time to gather the whole group, the world would have changed already at that time. And of course, now we'd like to say probably still to touch upon and go back to the subject of God fighters. We'd like to give one more indicative example, an example of what people who have betrayed God experience, because
Emptiness.
I'd like to read aloud a letter which was dictated by, let's say, a famous God fighter to his mentor and partner. Why was it dictated? Because he, so to say, never learned to write, but established, let's say, a transatlantic corporation.
No names.
Yes, no names. The thing is that it so happened that our participant has access to the archives of this corporation, and he found this letter exactly where you had indicated, and he managed to photograph and to translate it for us. It was translated into English though, but we've already translated it into Russian. Of course, I'll read the letter without names and only in the context and within the framework of the topic which we are discussing. It will be an extract.
I hope without the first part of the letter, right?
Let's say it'll be an extract only of that desperate revelation of this man, which became the last in their communication. You increased my doubts about him by saying that everything he said wasn't true. You asked me, what did I get while following him? You asked, did I really get that glory and respect which people expressed to him? You said that I was just like him, and he was just like any person in that crowd of people whom he was telling what everyone knew anyway. You forced me to be jealous and to start hating him. You said that we'd be able to give people much more than he gave, and I believed you. But when I was with him, I felt peace ahead of me. Yes, I didn't value that because I had it. Yes, I didn't understand a lot of what he was saying, and I doubted many things, but I was alive, until I betrayed him and followed you. And now I'm scared to be alone. Inner fear is tormenting me. Fear is all I have now. And now I just feel that I have a black abyss ahead of me, which is sucking me in. I feel as if I'm standing at the edge of a cliff and there is a precipice in front of me and something is pushing me into it. I feel that only one step remains. Just one step, and I'll be falling into it eternally. Now I know you are the liar, and I damn you. Certainly, the fate of this person doesn't require any extra comments because this is basically a typical example of what people who have betrayed God eventually reap. The system catches them precisely on doubts, but what's interesting is that the system implants these very doubts into people's heads as stereotypical programs from consciousness.
Right. At initial stages, especially during the first steps on the spiritual path, the system always instills doubts into a person that you won't make it, you deserve nothing, you are no one. Or when a person experiences this outburst of inner joy and true love, or when he begins to feel this warmth coming from his soul, consciousness is again telling him that all this is wrong, all this is temporary, or it has seemed to you. It happens even that demons in one's head start talking. As it is said, they start talking just like in the example of this man. By the way, it's an absolutely real story. And consciousness can instill that this isn't so. This is so, guys. And it forces one to doubt everything, God, oneself, and everything else. But the contagion is so deceitful, pardon me for such a word, but it cannot be called otherwise. Because this system is actually spreading from one person to another, like a contagion, especially in such God-fighting or dissemination of nonsense or something else. But what is behind this, in fact? Just the system's desire not to lose its slave from its stall. Nothing more. While people listen and have doubts. However, what does the first rule on the spiritual path say? The system is telling you, you won't make it. Laugh and don't listen. And never support this thought, but overstep and go. You will make it. You will, my friend. This is easy. The system is telling you, you don't feel anything. It's consciousness that doesn't feel anything, and it tries to associate itself with you. You will feel if you open up. You just need to tune in to the right spiritual wave, like a radio. And then you'll be resonating with everyone else. Then you'll be resonating with the spiritual world. It's impossible not to feel. But the system immediately distracts you from this radio and says, it's interesting. What is there on the other wave? Listen to the news. Go there. Do this. Go listen to the news, but don't turn off the radio. Then everything will be fine. If it is inside you, then you won't lose your way and won't get lost in this world. And no matter who tells you what, after all, these people, especially God fighters, well, they don't deserve attention at all. Well, what can you do? Just laugh to their face. For instance, if this man would have laughed to his mentor's face and didn't betray, like others, after all, everyone remained faithful, except, well, never mind him. Everyone reaps his own fruit. This is the highest fairness. God gives absolute freedom to a human being. He gives the right of choice, to live or to die, to be a friend, to be a part of the spiritual world, to become an angel, one of them, or to remain a slave of Satan. It's you who choose, my friend, no one else. No one can force you to die if you want to live. But no one can force you to live either if you want to die. And this is true.
Igor Mikhailovich, going back to the story of the Templars, it turns out that undoubtedly the system...
Their problem was that they were closed. Really. And we literally talked about this before. Well, basically we are talking about one and the same thing. If they had opened initially to people when they gained power, or at least if they hadn't been afraid to assemble an entire group, what was driving them? And again, despite the fact that they were highly spiritual, for people there is no organization, no order that did as much for humanity as they did. All that followed lived for themselves while they lived for people. And really, despite the fact that they had enormous wealth which they spent on people, none of them owned anything except honor, freedom, brotherhood, and inner fire, which was given to them precisely by that very Maria's group. And they didn't need anything else either. Why would one need anything trivial, earthly, when there is something greater, when there is the real thing? But the organization's interests still continued to prevail. And so that there is an understanding, if they had expanded the group and had brought it up to 72 people, then we would no longer talk about some organization or some Templars. Yes, the devil would have been defeated by them back then. But that momentum which they picked up, organizing their order in total secrecy, which later on gained power, gained fame, and the initial impetus due to, like, the artifact. Thanks for calling it nicely. It certainly engendered enormous power in them, but still, they behaved a little bit unhumanely. They shouldn't have closed themselves, and the devil would have been enslaved long ago, and we wouldn't have what we have now, because there have also been civilizations that had this. But the way they did it, of course, they didn't make it in time. They just didn't have enough time to create a group that could have resisted the system when the system turned on them in full measure, and it made its puppets. After all, the system works very simply. This doesn't mean that some kind of devilkin comes, the way he is drawn with horns and a tail and a pitchfork and makes them disperse. No, it's people who come. And the devil acts via your consciousness and via the consciousness of other people. It implants the necessary thoughts in them, and they act like puppets. The same happened at that time. The Pope, together with the king, all of a sudden, they began to desire a lot of money that belonged to the Templars. Well, but nothing happens out of the blue. Happenstances don't just happen. They are planned by someone. They are needed for some reason. When it comes to such matters, global matters. But what's interesting is something else. The fact that the Templar story did have a continuation. A continuation not only in terms of female followers. By the way, this is also an interesting point, that in fact, the 33 beads on the rosary had their own names, each little bead. And later, this was forgotten, and now people don't even remember the stories of why. They walk around, touching the beads. Some are just fiddling around so as to, as they say, stay busy. But there were also those who created exactly the opposite fellowship. While the Templars were free stonecutters, there were organizations created after them, even secret orders, and more than one, of Freemasons. And the saddest part is that they created kind of a mirror reflection, or, as it is said, a reflection in a dark mirror. Like Maria's group, they created a completely male group. And it was called by a name not named today. In this group, it also gave powers, but anti-Allat ones. It gave public speaking abilities and brute, malevolent force, and the warriors of these closed groups acted with underhandedness and sneakiness, by deceit and lies, but they also achieved, let's put it this way, certain results by earthly parameters in this three-dimensional world. Well, this world will end, not to mention human life.
Igor Mikhailovich, you've just said,
It's all pointless.
you have just said about these power male groups in which, let's say, sodomy was practiced.
Sodomy, yes.
Yes. Can you tell us in general the phenomenon of homosexuality in modern society, sodomy, what kind of phenomenon is it which...
Well, again, it has simply been promoted by those whom I've just talked about. This way, it is easier to hide. Let's say, you're straw in a haystack, right? But if we touch upon the topic of homosexuality in general, many people are now simply, there is such a fashion. And so people imitate, well, as we said, to stand out from the crowd.
It's imposed.
Imitation. A lot is written about it. A lot is being told. It's lobbied for, laws are already passed. Well, and so many people get there by following this trend. But in reality, there are those who, being in a male body, feel like a woman. But this is due to the activity of subpersonality, which was a woman when she was alive. But she is active, and she suppresses a new personality, even a male personality in a new body. And then the person feels like a woman. Sex with a woman is not acceptable for him. He's attracted to men. Well, there is such a phenomenon.
An active subpersonality.
Absolutely right.
It's interesting that...
I just want to say, I'm sorry, I interrupt, because following questions will arise right away. Is it good? Is it bad? Guys, well, it's neither. It's physical activity. That's why it has nothing to do with anything at all.
Regarding paradoxes in modern society, in recent years, such a worldwide trend has been observed as a decrease in sexual activity among people, and this phenomenon has been called the celibacy syndrome. And just a few years ago, sociologists recorded a decline in young people's interest in both marriage and intimacy up to the point of complete denial of them.
Yes, and it's interesting that they don't even have sexual pictures in their heads. And even this sexual advertising doesn't affect them.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't work, of course. But there is only one reason for it. And I'll even say a bit more. Lately, well, let's say, last 10 years or so, all over the world, but people are quiet about it. For now. No one is talking about it. Such a tendency is observed that children start talking later. They develop a little bit later than it was 10 years ago. For now, it's not talked about. But this question will soon arise, and people will begin to talk a lot about it. And a lot of excuses will come up, starting with GMOs, genetically modified products, and the like, and ending with banally Wi-Fi. Let's say, cellular communication. Supposedly, it has an effect, and thus the brain is developed with a delay. But then children develop, they catch up with their peers, and it's not noticeable. But what is the reason? The reason is that secondary, after all, primary consciousness develops normally. They eat normally, they start to walk even earlier than to talk, let's say, and so on. But secondary consciousness lags behind in development compared to children 10 years ago and earlier. And exactly this asexuality which is developing and this underdevelopment of secondary consciousness indicates really scary and serious things to those who know. It indicates that the system is saving its power. The system itself starts accumulating energy. After all, it spends a lot of energy on development of secondary consciousness. Later, it pays off 100-fold. But in order for it to start paying off, and it starts paying off already sometime after the primary surge in a child, at the age of 5 to 6 years. Before that, the system basically feeds him. It develops him, but it also dictates. It enslaves a personality. It's clear, but it pays off much later, and it especially starts paying off after the secondary surge at the age of 11 to 15 years. Thereby, it stops investing, it is saving. We have also been analyzing today that sex in the head, again, means constant implantations from the system. But if a person is already enslaved, if he's literally a slave, why does he need this support? After all, these are enormous expenditures. Therefore, the system begins to save on this. A person is already a slave. He's not going anywhere. He's already investing the power of his attention, his emotions, and everything else in the mundane, in gadgets, in games, and whatever else. However, this is a very serious trend. This indicates the end of times.
This is interesting because it was exactly the end of times which was mentioned in all the religions, in all the holy scriptures. It was said that these times would come, and that the one who would come, he was called differently in every religion, that a messenger from God's world would come in these end times. In particular, in Hinduism, in the Vishnuid scriptures, it was said that Kalki avatar, or the avatar of the white horse, who would be the last incarnation of Vishnu, the righteous and the true one on the white horse, who would come in the end times. And it was noted that this period would bring the renewal of creation and restoration of purity, that the souls of the people living at the end of the Kalki era will awaken and become pure like crystal. There was also an interesting fact that it was described how each of these eras, each of these yugas ended. It was said that each time the earth changes its appearance, flooding one system of continents and rising up another one. The Buddhist sutras talk about the coming of Maitreya. The Confucian texts also contain information about the appearance of the true human who will establish universal peace on earth. He is called Imam Mahdi by Muslims, the Comforter in Christianity. In the revelation of John the Evangelist, there is information that a rider will come on a white horse who is clothed in clothes covered with blood. He is called Faithful and True, who righteously judges and wages war. Generally speaking, it turns out that in all,
someone will come and do something for you.
This is exactly the way consciousness gives people hope. It gives such a hope.
Of course. All this refers to the same thing. But consciousness has interfered here, too. And all this is told about the fact that, yes, someone will come, no matter how differently he might be called, yet this is the same person, let's say. But the point is that he is just a flag. And depending on which flag people will stand under, that's what will happen. People must do this. This is the world of people, and people must choose to live or to die, to become a part of the spiritual world or to remain slaves. After all, this is really so. No one will do it for them. How can anyone come and force them, especially the messenger from the spiritual world, who will come and break the most fundamental, God's word? This is unthinkable. After all, God said that a human being is free, and he has the right to choose, right? I'm not saying that he won't come. He will come, yes. But this is just a flag. Well, it's you people who have to change the world yourselves, if you want to. And if you don't want to, then don't change anything. As a matter of fact, there are no neutral people anymore. Everyone serves, even if they don't know that they serve. However, some people serve Satan, while some people serve God. The only question is whom you serve.